And welcome to our supply chain school session on sustainable procurement and procurement. Is there a difference? So this is a slightly different session that those of you who have been familiar with sessions on the school. This is a bit of a debate where we're going to be asking some very experienced and expert people in the industry for their opinions and to have a bit of a discussion. A couple of housekeeping points, if I can. We are recording today's session. So if you don't want your camera to be seen on the recording, then please switch it off. I think my colleague Rosie has muted everybody, so please do stay on mute as we go through the session, because we've got a very large number of people. I think over 200 people booked on today's session. Obviously the background noise can be a bit intrusive. If you have something to say or a question to ask, then please do use the chat function, and we'll try and mediate as many questions as we possibly can. So a brief introduction from me. I'm Sean McCarthy. I chair the Supply Chain School, and I'm going to be chairing today's debate and trying to keep the speakers on message, as it were, which is going to be quite a challenge. And please feel free to join in. As I say, ask questions, make comments. I won't go through the process of introducing the speakers. I will ask them just to introduce themselves. We're going to ask each speaker to talk for 10 minutes or so on the subject, and then we'll kind of open up the conversation. By way of a bit of background, I guess I've been working in the field of sustainable procurement for maybe 20 years now, and it's becoming more and more embedded, and today's subject is really about how embedded is sustainability in the procurement profession. The people that you're going to hear from, I guess in that period, I've worked with all of them on and off for many of those years. So we have, I won't try and count up the number of years of experience we have on the panel today, because it could be quite embarrassing and possibly a little bit depressing. But needless to say that there is an awful lot of experience in the virtual room today that hopefully we can learn from, and we can take some views from. So the exam question is sustainable procurement and procurement. Is there a difference? The inference to that question obviously is how embedded do we believe sustainability is in the procurement profession today? And I'm going to start off with Aaron Reid from Balfour Beatty. And Aaron, what's your opinion?
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, my name's Aaron Reid. I'm Head of Sustainability and Sustainable Procurement at Balfour Beatty. Been in and around the sustainable procurement agenda for about 12, 13 or so years now. The danger of going first in these types of situations is I've got the potential to steal everybody else's thunder, and so I'm going to do my best to make sure I don't do that, and keep this as brief as possible, and hopefully get into more of a debate kind of as we go through. But certainly from my perspective, you know, I recognise that the built environment sector that we're part of has got a disproportionate opportunity to influence sustainability outcomes, given the amount of stuff that we use, the amount of stuff that we throw away, the amount of people we employ, the nature of our engagement with different communities. At Balfour Beatty, we take that responsibility very seriously. You may have seen recently we've just published a brand new shiny sustainability strategy, which focuses around environment, material use and communities as our most material focus areas. The issue with that, though, is that Balfour Beatty, I think, is not unique in the fact that most of what we do is delivered by our supply chain. And so for all of the big shiny ambitions that we have and the great ambitions that our customers have, actually, unless we can engage, unless we can select, unless we can manage, unless we can performance manage the right suppliers who can support us to deliver those ambitions, then we're going to be absolutely nowhere. And so for me, it's not just about an organizational commitment or a customer commitment. Those commitments can only be delivered through the supply chain. Arguably, because of that, say 80-20 split, so 80% of what we do delivered by supply chain, 20% by us. Arguably, our procurement professionals have got more of an opportunity to influence sustainability outcomes than our sustainability professionals, which is, terrible news for sustainability professionals, and quite a burden and quite a responsibility for procurement professionals, because at the end of the day, that's they're not sustainability subject matter experts, and again, arguably should they be so. What we have done at Balfour Beatty is embed based on a belief, and that belief is that sustainability is now just a core competency of a 21st century procurement professional, and we've now embedded as part of our competency framework for procurement people a straight sustainable procurement competence alongside the CIPS ethical procurement piece around ethical procurement. Just a side note, by the way, really encouraged to see the work that CIPS have been doing over the last couple of years to integrate more sustainability into their programs, into their qualifications, and throughout the competency, their own competency framework. We've been working with the likes of the Civil Engineering, Chartered Institute of Civil Engineering, Surveyors Institute as well, to help them to embed sustainability as a competency within their competency framework. The other thing that we've been doing is not only embedding it as part of the competency framework, ensuring that procurement people have got the right understanding, the right technical knowledge to make the right, but also integrating sustainability into our e-procurement system to actually make it easier for them to ask the right questions of the right suppliers and evaluate them in the right way. And so for me, that's probably been the single biggest thing we've done beyond the competency framework piece, because now it's a case of, I am buying bricks and you're presented with the relevant and proportionate questions for that thing you are buying of a particular value, and the procurement system is able to automatically evaluate the stuff coming back with some kind of human intervention around some of the higher value contracts. My final point, I suppose, that I'll leave you on is, in answer to the question, for me, sustainable procurement is just good procurement, and the ultimate objective, I suppose, and the big challenge for our procurement people is we want procurement that delivers solutions that can also deliver best value over the entire life cycle of the asset, whilst having a positive impact on people and society and the environment without compromising cost and quality. That, for me, is what good procurement looks like. So happy to follow up and pick up in the Q&A, but that's my starting position for now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Aaron. A quick question before we move on. When we talk about procurement in the context of your organisation, there's often a distinction between what people call procurement and what people call commercial. What's your view on that? Because I find it, having worked previously in other sectors, I find it a bit weird that that there's sort of one faction of people in an organisation that let contracts, and then another faction of people in an organisation that manage the contracts, and of course they often come from different professional institutions. So we talked about CIPS. Procurement people are often mostly CIPS members, but those people that call themselves commercial, which in my opinion probably do a very similar job, are often members of RICS. What's your view about the distinction, and are there differences between how embedded that practice is across your organisations and other organisations that you're aware of?
Yes, commercial people tell me that they're far busier than procurement people, and as a consequence,
of course they are.
I think that's what they tell me. But certainly, it's true that probably commercial people in our business maybe do more procurement than our procurement people do, and it's something that we've recognised in terms of the need to bring them on the journey as well. I'm pretty comfortable with the work we've done around our procurement function and where they are on their journey in terms of delivering sustainability outcomes. I'm comfortable with the influence that procurement has around creating the conditions for commercial to conduct their procurement through. But I think that's the importance of the work that we're doing with the Chartered Institute of Civil Engineering Surveyors, because we're leading that piece of work actually for them, where we're developing a set of competencies that won't just affect Balfour Beatty, but will in fact possibly infect the entire kind of commercial fraternity more broadly in our sector. But that's also the other reason why we embedded sustainability into our e-procurement system, because where we've gone with procurement in terms of, winning hearts and minds, upskilling them, building competence and capability, it's a different journey for commercial. And as I say, they're far too busy. And so we've simply just embedded it in the system. We've made it harder for them not to consider sustainability considerations than for them not to do it at all. But I very definitely recognise the distinction. I recognise the different places they are in their journey, but we're trying to attack that from two different angles in terms of the CIES work, CICIS work, and also the work to embed it in process. Because if it's literally, the click of a button, and I appreciate that's a bit reductive, but at the very least, all of our suppliers will now be asked. And this is the other thing, I suppose, as well, is that historically, and what many organisations do, is they have we used to have this huge 87-page document with our health, safety, environment, quality and sustainability conditions for subcontractors in there, and we'd send it out and say, do you comply with all of these requirements? And they'd send it back and they say, oh yes, of course we will. And actually that's at the heart of sustainable procurement is this principle of relevance and proportionality. We've got no opportunity within that sort of approach to actually assess an individual supplier's capability to deliver against that. And when we've got customers like National Grid and others who are very serious about the sustainability outcomes that they want us to deliver, we have to make sure we choose the right suppliers. And so again, embedding it into the process now means that we can actually, and automating that evaluation, we can assess the capability of suppliers against not quite 87 pages, but against those that are relevant and proportionate to the size of the contract. And again, for commercial people, it's as simple as pushing a button. So yeah, definitely a distinction, definitely a different journey, but definitely needs attacking in slightly different ways. So yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Aaron. So it's a really good point about actually, once something is embedded in process, then we are a long way on that journey towards embedding this good practice. Can I turn to Mel De Silva now? Mel has joined Action Sustainability, I'm really delighted to say, in the last couple of weeks. But we've asked Mel to speak from a perspective of her experience on HS2 and Thames Tideway, and where those big joint ventures are going in terms again of embedding sustainable procurement. So Mel, what's your view?
Yeah, hi, I'm Melita De Silva, and I've got 17 years experience in procurement, 3 of which in sustainable procurement. So if I look at good procurement and sustainable procurement, early on in my career, good procurement was all about cost, quality, get the subcontract awarded, get the supplier on site, absolutely no consideration for sustainability whatsoever. Having worked on Tideway and Crossrail to begin with, you realize that sustainability is a client-driven exercise. So typically we take the head contract works information, slow it down, the supplier would say, like Aaron said, yes, I comply, we just keep that for the audit, and that's what it is. On High Speed 2 enabling works, we decided to firmly embed sustainability into the procurement process. Again, I felt like that was a very forced exercise, very client driven. So I was taken out of the procurement team, given a fancy title of sustainability coordinator, and it was my job to embed sustainability into the procurement process, and I became procurement team's worst enemy. Having said that, I had to embed sustainability KPIs. So if it was EDI, carbon management, offsite, into Compete For, which is your open advert to the market, your pre-qualification, your invitation to tender, your performance reviews, measuring and monitoring. It went pretty well, but it was quite a struggle trying to coordinate a procurement team and an actual sustainability social value delivery team. When you take into account all of these large mega projects are joint ventures between a lot of main works contractors, each of whose sustainability maturity is so different, their values and visions are so different. We had a good outcome, we achieved a good social value, which was great. I moved on now to the main works. If you look at High Speed 2 main work, sustainability is embedded right through the procurement process, because we learned from our mistakes. We started pretty early on in the process. And having done that, the supply chain are on board with all things sustainable. Sean had asked me this question in the interview, and he said, Mel, why are people so afraid of making a good sustainability policy, of making that commitment? And from my experience, I think people, when you make a commitment, you have to meet those targets and KPIs, and people are afraid of sustainability. They think it's, oh my God, I can't achieve this. But when you look at what we can achieve, the supply chain is pretty ready in the market to offer us those solutions. They have innovated, they have digitalized, and it's only about a matter of us asking for that, and they're able to meet our targets and KPIs. So that's been my experience so far. How embedded is sustainability in procurement? Helen, I don't think you and me are going to become extinct anytime soon. We've got a good 20, 30 years more to go. So I think we'll still be here for another 20, 30 years. So that's just my experience.
Thanks very much. I think there's some really interesting points in there about client drivers, obviously, and also, yeah, the supply chain is often capable of doing more than we think, and we sometimes just have to ask for it. So thank you very much for that. So talking about client drivers, and Aaron has already name checked National Grid as a client that takes this very seriously. So I'll hand over to Natalie from National Grid. Natalie, what's your perspective as a client?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Natalie Ritchie. I work in National Grid, as we just said. So I work within our procurement function, but I have a specific supply chain sustainability role. So similar to what Mel just talked about, I work with procurement and promote sustainability, and have been working for the last 4 years within National Grid, trying to get that embedded and become business as usual. Prior to National Grid, I worked in a very different industry, in chocolate, so at Cadbury, what is now Mondelez, but was involved in sustainability, looking at origins and supply chain mapping, and very different agenda, but brought a lot of that back into the role within National Grid. So I would say when I joined 4 years ago, sustainability was very much focused on the environmental agenda, which makes complete sense within National Grid in terms of the industry that we're in. But we have an environmental sustainability team. And I was literally trying to talk to people about the broader context of sustainability on the social and economic aspects as well. So I've had that challenge to get that thinking a bit broader. So when I first came in fact, we used Action Sustainability to do a mapping against the ISO 2400 guidance standard. And I knew what the results would be, but I had that as evidence then to say where the gaps were. So it needed to be, positioned at leadership more evidently. It needed to be embedded into the procurement process, more explicitly, and it needed to have the training and the due diligence and the risk analysis as part of the process. So that was, I guess, the grounding point at that stage to have the business case to take that forward. 4 years on, and it's taken a long time to get there, we have embedded sustainability into the procurement process. So we have, and to the other points, we've tried to put in place a relevancy-based tool. So I think in the past, they tried to implement a whole suite of questions that were applied in every single tender, regardless of whether it was relevant or not. We now have a tool where, very simplistically, is carbon relevant, social issues relevant around human rights, skills, workforce resilience, SME, local supply. We have a number of sort of key trigger questions up front that we try and, we implement and get the procurement people to consider. So in every sourcing strategy, they have this checklist to say, have you implemented the sustainability assessment tool? Have you considered the relevancy? And hopefully that will then flow through into the process. I think another thing that's driven a lot of the change is the regulatory piece with Ofgem. So we have a regulatory review period every 5 years. We're about to launch what we're calling the RIIO2 period in April of this year, which will run into up to 2026. And I think a key change there is that responsible procurement is part of that business plan. That's never really been the case before. So previously there were commitments around the environmental agenda, but now we have a suite of commitments in there around, our commitment to the living wage, working with local supply, carbon reduction in the supply chain, diversity in the supply chain. So there's a range of commitments in there. It's in the public domain if you look very carefully on our website and can find that plan. But that is driving a lot of the agenda now. So hopefully, some of our larger contractors who we work closely with will have seen that coming through in our tenders. So those questions are now very explicit in terms of the ask and how you would help us deliver on those RIIO and Ofgem commitments. That's very UK specific. National Grid is a US and a UK organisation. So in addition to that, in October of last year, we launched our Responsible Business Charter, which has taken for the procurement piece a lot of the RIIO elements, but it's much broader from a business context. And we're now in the process of developing a responsible procurement strategy that will realign some of those commitments at a more global level. And there are common themes in there around people, communities, environment, economy. So I need to shift my model slightly under those new pillars, but the intent is very much the same. So I think for National Grid, we've definitely been on a journey, as you say, from the last 5 years within procurement. It's something that the procurement people want to get involved in. So to move away from that traditional tendering activity and have that broader professional procurement approach with sustainability as part of it. We promote very strongly CIPS. We promote the charter stateship in CIPS, which has that ethical element as well. So we're trying to align all of the training. We have an employee promise within procurement, and we've embedded the fact that ethical and sustainable procurement is part of that. So that means if you join National Grid, it would be part of the portfolio of the work that you do, rather than just traditional procurement. And I think that's very much an ask of the people that are working, and hopefully that will mean we retain people longer and they want to work with National Grid in an organisation that has those ethics behind it. And then just as a final point, I would just say, as a client, I think we have a really key role, because we're positioning a lot of this at the front end, and then I'm reliant on the larger contractors to deliver that, and then they are reliant on their supply chain. So it's trying to flow that message through the whole of that procurement process, because we're sort of setting the scene, if you like, hopefully, and we've still got a long way to go, but hopefully we're sort of setting that scene quite strongly now. So
brilliant, thanks Natalie. Yeah, I think a couple of interesting points in there. Firstly, the influence of the regulator. It's very easy to think that as National Grid, as a big client, you're at the top of the food chain, but actually you are very heavily influenced by your regulator. And I guess my observation would be, I think Ofgem have been quite slow to come to the party. That they saw themselves as purely an economic regulator in the past, and that's changing very rapidly, which is changing what you do. The prioritisation point is a good one. It can't be a one-size-fits-all solution, and that's something that I've fought very, very hard to get incorporated into the ISO standard, to make sure that the world understood that. If you start asking your supply chain a lot of questions that are irrelevant to them, or laying requirements on them that are irrelevant to them, then the price is going to go up, because you're asking for things that aren't relevant, and you're perpetuating the myth then that sustainability costs more. It's also very easy for I guess for us in the UK to think of National Grid as a UK institution, but actually you're a very big business in the United States as well. What's your view in terms of, do you feel, and we tend to think of the United States as being light years behind in sustainability, what's your view from your experience? How much are they on this agenda in the States?
I think they are behind the UK in terms of some of the topics. So, a very obvious one is on the carbon agenda. So, we have very explicit commitments in the UK around net zero. Hopefully with the new administration in the US, that will shift somewhat. But, we go out to CDP every year, it's the Carbon Disclosure Project, and we go to the US and UK suppliers. there's a very different response rate. So I think about 67% of the UK suppliers have carbon reduction targets, only about 30% of the US suppliers do. So there's still a big shift to move that agenda. And similarly on the human rights, we talk about modern slavery and they, their hackles rise, and it's like, how could you even possibly? So there's still, there's still that position. So there's a way to go still, and I think with the UK and with the Ofgem regulator, that's driven a lot of the agenda, and we're literally going to have to expand that into the US. Where I would say the US are very strong is on supply diversity. So that has traditionally been their big focus and big ticket item, because they have to report on it jurisdictionally. So they have lots of data around veteran-owned, women-owned, disability, whereas we struggle to have that level of data and KPIs within the UK. So there's different, I guess, agenda topics, but we're trying to, we're a global team, so I work with somebody in the US, and we're trying to align that in a global way, but there'll be elements that will differ. Living wage is another one that there's a very different model within the US and the UK.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, the supplier diversity thing is very much an American thing, isn't it? Whereas we in the UK and maybe other parts of Europe as well tend to focus more on workforce diversity. So it's a slightly different approach.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So moving seamlessly on then to Duncan. Again, CIPS have been name checked a couple of times, so here's Duncan from CIPS. Obviously very interested in your perspective, Duncan, from a professional institution, but also recognising that CIPS are very much a global organisation these days, so we'd be very interested to hear from you in terms of not just the construction sector but actually other sectors and other countries. Where in your opinion are we on this issue of embedding sustainability?
Thank you, Sean. Good morning to you all. So Duncan Brock, Director at CIPS. I've been with the Institute now for about 9 years, but I've been in procurement all my working life. And Sean, I think, said at the beginning, we'd be embarrassed if we said how many years experience we've got. I'm probably one of those. This has been my profession, and I've worked across a whole range of sectors and internationally as well. And trying to embed good practice procurement has been something that really has been a passion of mine all the way through. And I think the question about sustainable procurement and good procurement, is there a difference? I actually think there is. And I'm going to sort of maybe bring that to life a bit with some experiences. But let me start on the positive side of sustainable procurement. I had the pleasure of interviewing a guy called Bertrand Conqueret from Henkel at our global conference back in October. It was really interesting. I first met him when he was 15 years ago at Henkel, when he was doing category management training. And I was doing that for him as a consultant. And 15 years on, you've got someone there who's a huge, passionate advocate of sustainability in the chemicals industry. The Sustainable Procurement Pledge, getting you individually to sign up to it as being a really committed to that. And I think when you meet someone like him, sustainable procurement, as we've already heard from the 3 speakers already today, it's a core of what he does. It's a core of what Henkel does and what some of the chemical companies have signed up to actually really drive sustainability forward. And so on that side, you go, well, actually, I can see there's a real passion and driver, a sector focus there that's really coming through strongly. And I know Bertrand was very keen to expand that out further. I also then sort of was thinking about this before we joined the session about, I remember running a session at another CIPS conference about a year or so ago. That's when we were allowed to do physical conferences rather than actually all staring at a screen. And we're actually in the QE2 Centre in London. I had a panel discussion I was running, and the question there was about sustainable procurement. Are we embedding it in the way that we could be? And what was really interesting for me in that conversation, and I think it's already been raised by Aaron and Nat and Mel as well, about it's the clients need to drive it. There has to be someone in your organisation who's going, we need to do this. And if I look at the people who are on that panel, I had a guy from Heathrow Airport, and he was very much going, our investors are saying to us that we have to be doing sustainability properly. We've got to be driving this forward because that's part of who we are. We had someone in there from Carlsberg, as she was saying, well, actually, it's the consumers who are driving it. You know, we need to get rid of the plastic round the 4 cans that we sell, because the consumers are saying, I don't want that plastic anymore. And therefore, that was the driver for them. There was someone there from Babcock, Juliet, who's now moved on. But she was very saying, no, it's the board. The board has said, for a USP for our organisation, we need to have sustainability at the core. Yes, of course, we've got our customers asking for it, like the MOD, but we've got to do it because that's a USP for us to win outsourced contracts and work as we go forward on that basis. And then we had Laura from Nationwide, who was saying, well, actually, it's driven by our members. You know, fundamentally, unless we're ethically in the right place, we're doing all the right things, then we're not going to have sustainability embedded in the way that, you know, we're not going to do things in the right way that would be in the ethos of our membership. I think that was really interesting for me, that you've got a number of drivers there that drive the people to do things differently and to want to do things differently, and therefore embed it in the organisation. So I think that's the positive side. If I then think of where we're at today as a procurement profession, I've probably got a slightly different view. Because if we're looking at, and we talk to a lot of procurement people all over the world, and if we're looking at the agenda for procurement currently, you know, we've all been through a really, really strange time and a tough time. But what's top of the agenda at the moment, and I'd say top of the agenda for most procurement people, is risk and resilience. You know, making sure their supply chains are robust, that they work, that they are maybe shorter than they were, that they understand what's going on down through their supply chains. I think it's really interesting. I think even in the construction sector, there's been a number of the procurement people I've spoken to who said, I was quite embarrassed that I didn't know what my supply chain was when this lockdown hit and COVID hit. You know, I hadn't got a clue where my stuff was coming from. And so risk and resilience and the focus on that, I think, is something that is top of the agenda at the moment. Of course, delivering value comes second on the list, or top on the list, depending on where you sit. And you can define value any way you want, but it's that sort of commercial benefit to the organisation. And I think, you know, Nat always mentioned, I think, you know, the ethical focus, the transparency, the need to eradicate fraud, corruption down through the supply chains is on that list as well. Now, sustainability is on the list, right? And I think, you know, sustainability, the need to focus on it. We've already heard from speakers today that it's there. The need to get innovation from your supplier base is on there, and the need to develop local, you know, SMEs. You know, the supplier diversity, I think that Nat just mentioned about. You know, there is a need there as well. But that's quite a broad spectrum of drivers and priorities for procurement. And I think the big challenge that we always have in procurement is aligning those and deciding on which ones are the best ones for your organisation. And it's I think Aaron mentioned at the beginning, you know, there's such a broad agenda that actually it is quite challenging as a procurement professional to have this broad skill set to do all those things. But it is also a need to make sure you're fully aligned with your organisation's priorities. And I think good procurement is about being fully aligned with your organised priorities and making sure you're delivering what your organisation wants. And I think the challenge we've got is some sectors are definitely see sustainability as being on the agenda. And to be honest, at the moment, I think with the economic challenges we're facing and some sectors who are under huge commercial pressure, I'm not sure sustainability is on the agenda. I'm not sure that they are really focusing on it, because it's not a priority for survival for that business in the short term. And I think that is the real challenge that we've got to embed it. And I think Mel mentioned a comment that, you know, 20 to 30 years we'll still be doing this. Well, I think we will, because I think there's a lot of organisations that still do need to wake up to the fact that they should be focusing on this, but they do need their organisation to support them. I don't think as a procurement person you can just go out there and do it without the organisation driver that sits in behind it. And I think across sectors it varies a lot. Across geography it varies dramatically. I think, you know, Nat was talking about the US. You know, I'm just on a call with the guys in South Africa and in Australia. Now, in Australia and New Zealand, it's a huge focus. They call it social procurement, but sustainability and the focus on that is incredibly strong. I don't see it in Africa. I don't really see it in the Middle East in the way that maybe we should be. but then parts of Europe are absolutely advocates and strength around driving it, in Germany and Scandinavia. So it is sector specific, and it is very much geographic drivers that come through. Our challenge in procurement, and certainly my challenge in CIPS, is to try and cover all those bases and really focus on the ones that are really important and relevant to the people of today. And and I think construction sector, I think, is another good example where there are people like Aaron and others who huge advocates, and I see other organisations where they're still come to the party and still need to really grasp this as being something that's important for them. So, is there a difference? Yes. Should there be a difference? No. And I think that's probably where the debates, I'm sure, will go on, Sean, as we go forward.
Okay, thanks very much, Duncan. Yeah, loads of interesting stuff in there. On the issue of drivers, it's one of the things that I was a very passionate advocate on the ISO 2400 committee of making sure that you start with your drivers and understanding them. And I think you just illustrated very well a range of organisations that are driven differently. And I've been running drivers workshops for I don't know how many years now, it's 10, 15 years, whatever. Where going in usually to a group of senior executives and saying, okay, we're going to have a discussion about what's driving us to procure more sustainably, or what's driving us to be more sustainable, and thinking through, is it the customer, is it shareholders, is it your own internal drivers, is it your own leadership, or whatever. I always say to the group, look, if then we map it on a radar diagram thing, and I've always said to the group, look, if you end up with a little diagram in the middle, with no strong drivers, then you don't need to do this. You don't need me. It's the last time you'll hear from me. I'll walk out of this room because you're not driven to be sustainable, so don't do it. Of course, I've never ever walked out of a room with a little diddly model in the middle, and organisations, a senior executive or board level decide that they don't need to be sustainable. And there were a lot of advocates on the committee from other parts of the world that were saying, in this standard, we need to make the case, we need to tell people why they should procure sustainably. And my opinion was always the opposite. No, we need to help people to understand for themselves why they should procure sustainably. And it's right, there are different drivers in some parts of the world, and in some parts of the world no drivers at all. So I think that's a really interesting kind of concept to think about, and a very good place to start when you start thinking about sustainable procurement.
Yeah, and Sean, maybe I could just come back on the other reflection I have, I think, back to your point about education and making people aware of it, is the other lens I would look through is, do I get a lot of requests for education, training, development in sustainable procurement? No. We get a few pockets of it, but we're not necessarily seeing that from a training and development need coming through from the procurement community anywhere near the level that it probably should be. Because you're right, everyone goes, yeah, of course we should do it. But then they say, well, actually, are you going to spend any money on actually getting your people to the level they need to be, on embedding the right processes that, a few people have already spoken about here. I'm not seeing that at the level of demand that probably should be based on what you've just described there. The people do get it, but are they really willing to put their money behind it to make the changes that need to be embedded?
Brilliant, thanks. Aaron, you put something up on the chat about drivers. Would you like to come in and talk to it?
Yeah, I was rapidly typing through 3 points there. Yeah, the first point around drivers is really interesting, and I'm conscious I'm stuck in my perspective from our sector, but certainly in our sector, we win work by bidding. And from a bidding perspective, we're seeing, anywhere between 10 and 30% of total available marks now going to social value and sustainability. Typically, we win or lose bids by less than 8%. And so when you've got 10 to 30% available for sustainability and social value, it's the key differentiator, and absolutely a driver for sustainability in our sector. That's underlined by public contract regulations, utility contract regulations, the Social Value Act, the recent PPN 0620, the construction playbook. There is a real kind of well-defined context and business case in our sector, which I appreciate isn't true elsewhere. However, I think whatever you're driven by, if your organisation does have a commitment to sustainability, then procurement has got to be seen as the key way, if not the key way, for delivering your sustainability ambitions. Because arguably, it's much easier to influence sustainability outcomes through procurement than it is within your own organisation. The power of procurement far outweighs any internal arguments within your business. You can get stuck in the politics, in the prioritisation. Do we need to do this? Should we do this? We've got all these other things that you've mentioned that we've got to do. When your customers are telling you, if you don't do this, you will not have any money, suddenly all the debate goes away and you can get on with it. And so arguably, it's easier to avoid those conversations within your own business and focus on what you can influence much more easily down your supply chain. A final point I wanted to mention, just around that risk and opportunity piece that you mentioned in terms of risk resilience, value, ethics. For me, there's another bit there, which is around responsibility, which goes back to this power of procurement piece. And I know this is a bit, you know, I'm a sustainability person, you would say that, wouldn't you? But, you know, when you see the likes of David Attenborough talking the other day about it's already too late, the economic crisis that we've got, that's been brought about by, you know, amongst other things, COVID, the societal challenges that we've got. What the hell are we going to do about that? We've all got kind of a personal responsibility to kind of play our part in that. And when we realise that procurement has got this disproportionate ability to influence outcomes, to support the climate crisis, to support the kind of cultural, social, economic crisis that we're going through at the moment, for me, you know, we're into the realms of responsibility. And even if, you know, it doesn't form part of your risk matrix, you can't clearly see an opportunity, why the hell not do it? Why not do it? Why not embed sustainability as part of your procurement process? Because you have got this responsibility and there is the opportunity to make such a difference. So I'll step back off my soapbox and hand back to Sean.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. But while I've still got you, because it's a related point that I was going to ask anyway, I guess in my experience of, you know, when I was starting to do some of this stuff in the construction sector back in about 15 years ago, it was the client. And I used to get very frustrated going into contractors and being told, well, you know, if the client asks for a sustainable one, then we'll deliver a sustainable one. And, you know, I used to rant a lot at them to say, well, you know, is it really all about the client? You know, don't you have your own conscience? Don't you have a mind of your own to actually set your stall out as being sustainable? And I think it was probably Skanska that were the kind of first out of the blocks, to, you know, with their journey to deep green and saying, look, when you buy from us, this is what you get. And I guess I've seen other leading contractors such as Balfour Beatty, Wilmot Dixon, Morgan Sindall, some of those others, now starting to establish a position. And, you know, Balfour Beatty's sustainability strategy is a very recent thing that I know has only just been published, where you as contractors do seem to be saying, this is what we stand for, rather than we'll just do whatever the client asks, and if the client doesn't ask for sustainability, then they won't get it. Do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we've definitely been on a journey in that regard. I think, you know, what focused minds and brought us to the table, I suspect in the first place, was very much around the client piece. But now, you know, sustainability is embedded as part of our cultural framework. It's who we are as much as what we do, and that's, you know, driven by, you know, our employees, our stakeholders, shareholders even now are a big voice in this in terms of the ESG piece. So yeah, I think, you know, when you buy from Balfour Beatty, there's a minimum standards that we are always going to deliver in terms of sustainability, regardless of what the customer expectation is. We'll tailor that and prioritize differently depending on what the customer expectation is. But as you say, we're in a place now where it's just, this is what you get when you buy Balfour Beatty, and we'll offer the customer and we'll work with the customer more sustainable options to help move them along as well. But yeah, absolutely. For us, we have our built to last corporate strategy, which used to be lean, expert, trusted and safe, and now it's lean, expert, trusted, safe and sustainable. It's absolutely embedded as part of our DNA and who we are. So very much a shift in the last couple of years for us. So.
Brilliant, thank you. Finally, Helen, I thought I'd leave Helen till last. Oh, you're going to leave me till last. Helen, what's your view?
Thanks for the build-up, Sean. Right, so I started off with one post-it note saying definitely. After all of the things I've been hearing, I have 10 post-it notes in front of me. So there's been really interesting discussion and debate. Just a bit of background into me. My name's Helen Carter. I work with Action Sustainability, have worked with Sean for about 13 years now. Sean, that long? And
yeah, you get less for manslaughter with good behaviour.
I know, I definitely do. And I've been in procurement, actually, I hate to say, about 30 years. I was in procurement during my uni days, and then basically left uni and have been in procurement ever since. I've worked in direct mail, I've worked in manufacturing, and probably the bulk of my experience, though, has been in construction. It's interesting, actually, because I've been doing the sustainable procurement journey for about 15 years. That's how I met Sean, working for Carillion a long time ago. And there's a couple of things that sprung to me when I've been hearing people talk, and that's around terminology and the purpose of what things are. I am incredibly passionate about procurement first, and then more passionate about sustainable procurement second. And I think coming from direct mail, coming from manufacturing, what I see in construction is the lack of understanding about what procurement actually is and what it currently does. We have a saying in sustainable procurement that procurement is the moment you know you need something to the end of life and disposal and everything that's in between. So Sean's already articulated that, well, there's commercial. Well, actually, there's engineering, there's the contract managers, there's the people who are in finance, who are the bane of our life when we talk about whole life costing. So when we talk about procurement, whether construction people like it or not, procurement is a backbone of what a company does to be able to deliver what it does. And Aaron's articulated that really well around the sort of reliance we have on the supply chain. So that's my first thing in terms of when we talk procurement, we aren't just talking the buyers who sit and tender and do a negotiation on a contract. We're talking about everybody who has an opportunity to influence that final outcome. And people in procurement aren't necessarily those that think they're in procurement, or sometimes they think they are and can do it better than the procurement people, but that's another conversation. The other issue around sustainability, the terminology of sustainability. I was working on Great Western Route Mod for about 3 years as part of a contract with Action Sustainability. And I used to go in and train the project managers around what sustainability was. And I always used to start my training with, here's a note, I am not a tree hugger. Sustainability is not about achieving necessarily an environmental outcome or even a people outcome. It's intrinsic to the way a business runs. So I've heard people talking about risk and resilience and supply chain transparency and everything else. Well, that's sustainability. That's what we're trying to achieve. So when we're talking about sustainability, we have to recognise that we're the sum of the parts, we're some of a supply chain. And that actually fundamentally as procurement, we have to make strong supply chains to allow us to achieve what it is we're doing. And what's now happening from a sustainability perspective is that the light is shining further and further down the chain as an organisation. I'm going to put some names out there for you. Nestle, Hershey, Biffa, Dell, Apple, Calabao, very disappointed about that one, I use their chocolate, Tesla, Mars. What have these guys got in common? And Biffa's stuck in there. They are all currently under civil lawsuits for problems and breaches in their supply chain around human rights and labour standards. So the reality is that from a supply chain perspective, we as organisations are only as strong as our weakest link. And as procurement, our profession is starting to change a little bit from not even value add. It's not even about adding value. It's about making sure that we're managing those risks. We're providing resilience. We understand what's going on in those supply chains. Yes, there's some value add that we can do, but take the S word out. And actually you do just get, I'm managing my supply chain more effectively and more efficiently. In the construction industry, we talk a lot about the fact that we've got skills shortages. We potentially got skill shortages. There's a moving feast as to whether we do or not. Actually, what we've got to start thinking about is how we educate, how we bring new entrants into the marketplace. Sustainability, but it's a business resilience issue. It's about how we engage our supply chain. So sometimes the biggest downside that we see in sustainable procurement is actually putting S in there, the S word, talking about sustainability, because as soon as you mention sustainability, people's perceptions immediately go to tree hugging or far right lefty hippie, or whatever their perceptions are around that sustainability. If you bring it into pragmatic, practical terms of, I have an impact that my business has to manage, or I have an impact I want to be ahead of, and I want to prepare for, and my supply chain is key to that, then that opens the doors to procurement, I think, and means that our profession actually has a massive opportunity to be much more influential. And it's very interesting to see those changes. So I think the tide is turning. I think we have to understand that the supply chain is our responsibility anyway, not just from Aaron's point, but our supply chain is our responsibility, and legislation is pushing us that way, but also better practices, as Duncan has intimated, about where the hell are we going to get our stuff from? How do we make sure our supply chain is there for us in these really weird times that we're currently sitting in? I think the other couple of things that have been really interesting from a point perspective is time. So both Natalie and Aaron, I know very well, have been in their various journeys, and they've both talked about the time that it took. It takes a long time to actually make these changes, and fundamentally some of the changes you need to make aren't even about sustainability, they're just about how you procure properly. And I remember doing a training course once where somebody said to me, so how do I do sustainable procurement? Somebody turns up with a requisition on my desk at Monday, and the kit was delivered on Saturday and was used. So how do I embed sustainable procurement? My response was, well, you don't. And actually, I'd question whether that's even good procurement, let alone sustainable procurement. That's just bad practice. You shouldn't be doing that. So a lot of the advice that I give to organisations when I work with them is about the power of good procurement, and actually the blockers tend to be the procurement processes themselves, not the sustainability issues. I think the other thing as well that I've heard a lot is the relevance piece and those drivers, that prioritised approach. If you don't know ISO 2400, go and have a look at the e-learning module. I'm biased, me and Sean wrote it, but it actually gives you a really good breakdown. And the key things that you need to think of from a sustainable procurement perspective are, why are you doing it? What's your driver? And Sean's right. Is it fundamental to you? Are you legislative based? That sets your level of ambition. You then have something called the policy that sets out your levels of ambition for the world to understand. So clarity of message to your supply chain is key, and not everybody's message is the same. So think about how that message resonates with your business, your organisational drivers. We have something called the golden thread that we've talked a lot about over the last 15 years since sustainable procurement comes in. I know with Grenfell that's going to have some legal connotations to it, but fundamentally it's the same. What is it we're trying to drive through our organisation into our supply chain, and the policy sets that direction. Train your individuals in your businesses, and that's not just your procurement teams, that's everybody who's involved in procurement, but keep the message proportional to what they need to do, so that you're not just doing what I do, which are on for hours about stuff that's generally interesting, but what does it mean to them? And then when you get into the procurement process, health and safety is now business as usual, guys. Sustainability is, but in a targeted way. So think about how that resonates in. But you have so much opportunity to be able to bring a lot of this stuff in. So time, resilience, profile, I think is really good. The final bit, excuse me, I would probably bring in is about the collaborative role of procurement. We as a function, as a team of professionals, have actually quite a good facilitation role to play in organisations. We bring the supply chain market to our organisation. But again, in my old days, I remember sitting down with the environmental team, and they were saying, how do we measure our waste? How do we know where our waste is coming from? Exploring what they were doing, it was contracted out. I said, have we ever asked them? Have we put it in their contracts? Have we actually done it? Oh no, didn't think about that. Actually just starting to talk to departments about what their needs are and how it influences. Procurement has this beautiful role of being able to pull all these threads together and then drive that into the way that your organisation goes. So I suppose my shout out to everybody is, number one, go and have a look at the ISO 2400 model if you haven't already. Go and look at the e-learning module. Take the motivational piece, as it's already been articulated. The drivers is really important. Why are you doing this? Sustainability is just the way of doing business. Take the S word out and think about what those key things are that affect your efficiency, your effectiveness, or are dealing with long-term issues that you've got to be able to deal with from a business perspective, and understand that the landscape is changing. So if you're further down the supply chain and your clients are coming to you to start asking you where you're getting things from, 9 times out of 10, it will be because they need to understand transparency, not because they want to go to your supplier and get it cheaper. I say 9 times out of 10, there might be the odd unethical individual, but the reality is that we need to get that transparency. So the collaborative approach is becoming more and more important, and I'd embrace that as a supplier in the supply chain. Sean told me that we had 10 minutes and he didn't think anyone would fill in, but I think I've just about done my 10 minutes. I could talk for hours, as you probably could tell, but that's just my takeaway. It isn't embedded as it should be, but my shout out is that I don't think procurement is, if I'm brutally honest, let alone sustainable procurement. There you are, Sean.
Brilliant, thanks very much, Helen. Okay, so we have just over half an hour. We have, I think at the last count, about 120 people out there. Do feel free to type in any questions or comments that you have into the chat. Otherwise, I get to ask all the questions, and I've got millions of them, and you won't get a chance to ask any. There's a number of threads of things that have come through the discussions today that I'd like to try and pick up on. So we've had a shout out for ISO 2400 several times, probably about 5 of them been from me actually, but if I can maybe start with Aaron, because you claim, probably correctly in my humble opinion, to have been the first organisation in the world to have had an ISO 2400 standard assessment very shortly after the standard was published. So it's something that you as Balfour Beatty have been using for as long as anybody now, because you started as soon as it was published. What's your view on the standard? How have you used it to embed the kind of professionalism in your procurement function that you described earlier?
Yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Sean. It's a bit like my. I don't like to talk about the fact that we were the first in the world to be assessed against the Global International Standard for Sustainable Procurement. In fact, I think we might have also been the first to be reassessed agained the global standard. You can read about that. You told
everybody. It was all over social media.
I may have mentioned it once or twice. I avoided it in this. Yeah, ISO was really helpful because it was. I describe it. It was our approach was a bit like a Swiss cheese, in that we were doing all this stuff and we felt we were moving in a reasonable direction, but what we didn't really know is kind of where the holes were in our approach. And it's only really when you kind of cut it open and have a good look that suddenly you realise where the holes were. The great thing about ISO 2400 is that it's not a certification standard. And when I first looked at ISO 2400, and I remember having conversations with Sean and Ian in the kind of early days of its development and BS 8903, and I was, this isn't a proper standard. If it doesn't have a certificate, I can hang on the wall and show off to my neighbours, then, what's the value? And actually, had it have been a certification standard, then it probably wouldn't have done what we wanted it to do, because all we really wanted was an honest assessment of where are we now against internationally recognised best practice and what should we be doing next. The problem with a certification standard is that in some organisations, certainly not in Balfour Beatty, but I'm sure in some organisations, there could be a tendency to push forward all the areas of great stuff that you're doing and hide away all the stuff that's not so good in a dark corner. Whereas because there wasn't the pressure around pass or fail, we actively pointed the assessors towards those dark corners, because those were the ones that we wanted to shine a light on the greatest. We don't want them to continue to be dark corners. We actively want to improve in those areas. And so that's the first thing about that. The second thing is that it was really good, I think, as Natalie said, in terms of helping to get a mandate for action within the business, because people didn't need to understand all of the complexities around sustainable procurement and the subtleties of individual actions. They simply now say, does this or does this not help us to improve our assessment against ISO 2400? If it's a yes, on you go. If it's a no, then please provide a business case and explain why we need to do this. And so it was really helpful in that regard as well. What we did is we've literally got an action plan off, so the idea is, we're trying to get to 100%. That would be the ideal. I suspect we won't, because there's that relevance and proportionality bit. There's that authenticity bit about applying a standard to an organisation in a way that's true to us. But we want to do as much as we can. And so we've identified those areas where we were weaker, and we've put in specific actions against those things. The commercial one is interesting because that came out in the first assessment as being somewhere where we certainly could do a bit more, and it was really helpful in getting us that mandate to start on the journey to kind of get into that commercial community. And so it's a very structured, methodical, logical way of working through where you are, what you need to do, and as Natalie said as well, supporting you to get that mandate for action to actually address those things. So that's how it's been helpful to us.
Thanks, Aaron. Natalie, I know you've also been using the standard within your own organisation. Do you have anything to add to what Aaron said?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't gone through a formal sort of evaluation, so we used an assessment at the very early days, and for me, as I said, it was to validate what I already knew and to use the argument within the business in terms of highlighting the gaps and to give me the evidence base, even though I could have said it myself in some ways. The going through that process sort of gave that external view on it a little bit. So we've done that, and we've done so there is a self-assessment tool on the website where you can go through that process, and I think that's really useful. It gives you a spider diagram of where you're positioned and where those gaps are. So for us, I think we were doing some of those elements. I think it's a fabulous approach if you're starting out, from scratch. So, if you want to set out your strategy and set out your stall, then it's a really great go-to process to work through and identify what you should focus on. So we're using that. We've embedded that in terms of one of our commitments that we will, align our approach to the ISO 2400. Then it's around, what metrics do we use? Because in a way, we'd need that external verification to say, right, we're positioned here. What, as Aaron's got that roadmap of where the gaps should take us to. So we're working through that at the moment. But it's been a really useful tool for us to position where we're at.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. Aaron's popped up a link in the chat to ISO2400.org, which is where you can find the self-assessment tool that Natalie referred to. This is a site that we as Action Sustainability actually sponsor and operate as part of our own social enterprise business and our own contribution to social value in trying to build the body of knowledge around the world around sustainable procurement. We have a hand up in the audience from Gemma. Do you have a question? Would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you. Thanks everyone. It's been really interesting so far. Organisation that's quite early in the sustainable procurement journey. Are there some quick wins that you could suggest we put in place?
Oh, would anybody like to answer that? Go on, Helen.
Your question is Sean.
Now, Helen's itching to answer.
Hi, Gemma. Yeah, I think there is. My advice would be to get some clarity first in what you're looking to do, and get some clearer direction. The quick wins that we have with most organisations that we talk to them is to create that policy and strategy around what's important. So defining sustainability for you. It feels like a bit of a mountain to go, but I think by doing that, what you then do is give a real clear journey of where you're looking to try and achieve. I think one of the downsides is if you go, everybody's talking carbon, everybody's talking social value, everybody's talking modern slavery, you'll end up peppering all over the place trying to do 20 million different things. So my first step, and in fact, Natalie's sort of intimated it, is to maybe look at the benchmarking tool on ISO 2400.org, assess yourself. And then very quickly start to think about what it means to you, what's your drivers and what it means, and articulate that in some sort of structure and policy. There are legislative things you can do. Obviously, you've got carbons to focus on, you've got modern slavery, but I think you need to get that collected quickly into a format that then drives your plan, your roadmap. That's just my start, Dan. Sean, you're on mute.
I'm on mute, I know, thanks Helen. And if I can ask everybody to go on mute, because we have got a bit of a background, somebody seems to be having a phone conversation in the background, so if you wouldn't mind please going on mute, or Rosie if you can mute everybody if you have the power to do that. We have a couple of hands up, so Melita and then Aaron, would you like to come in?
Yeah, hi. So just to build on the back of what Helen said in reply to Gemma's question, one of the things I did on High Speed 2 was to look at the impacts that the parent companies had, but also the impact that the project had around us. So one of the major ones was community engagement and investment. And typically, if you've heard of the High Speed 2 project, then we've done £100 million worth of demolition. The local residents were absolutely not happy with us. You would have heard of that in the news. So those were our major impacts. So build your policy strategy, but analyze where are the major areas of impacts, and that will help you build your strategy and do your heat mapping properly. So just an example.
Okay, thanks very much. And Aaron has a hand up.
Yeah, just a quick point for me, something that's worked really well for me, particularly in the early days. And I think, a key point here is you can only take an organisation and you can only take people from where they are, not where you would hope they would be. And so for me, the two first things were around understanding the sustainability commitment within the organisation and understanding what are the most material sustainability risks and opportunities, and then going to the procurement function and the commercial function and the other stakeholders that Helen's identified. And I'd say this approach has been good for me, which is around identify who are your key stakeholders, but also what's important to them, what are their current priorities? Because what I found was if you go to them with another thing, here's this sustainability thing that you also need to think about in addition to everything else, then that can be perceived as a burden and something extra and I haven't got time to do. Whereas what I did was try to position sustainability as something which supported them to deliver those things which were already a priority and already important to them. And so if you want to save money, I want to save money, and I've got 7 new ways that can help you to save money. You want to reduce risk? I want to reduce risk. I've got 12 new ways that can help you to reduce your risk, etc., etc. So I'm still achieving my outcome. They're still achieving their outcome. I'm just giving them new things rather than present it as this is what you do. I now need you to do sustainability. It's just using sustainability as a new way to deliver the things that are already important to them. So I don't know if that's helpful, but it was particularly helpful in terms of the approach I took.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I think it is particularly helpful in almost any aspects of business. And Natalie's just put a point up in this chat about aligning to business strategy. It is all about alignment and alignment of values and purpose. So that, as you say, this isn't being introduced as yet another thing. Okay, so if I can just backtrack a little bit to something that I think Aaron said first, and I'd be interested in Duncan's and I guess everybody else's perspective on it. And this is in terms of expertise and competence of procurement people. One of the things I argued for very strongly, again, I spent 4 years arguing strongly on the ISO committee about just about everything, and I usually won, which is why we've got the standard that we've got. My view of a procurement professional is that procurement people cannot be experts on everything. In fact, I could possibly argue that a procurement person is an expert on nothing. And Helen mentioned that the facilitation role of procurement, which I think is very important. Certainly in my years as a procurement professional, I always saw myself as an integrator of lots of other professions. So a lot of my early procurement career was in the oil and gas sector. So, we were buying some really complex engineering piece of kit. So I need some help from an engineer. If we were buying a pipeline with, with gas that goes down to low temperatures, I need a metallurgist. If I got a particularly complex contract, I need help from a lawyer. If I've got some, financially engineered deal that I'm doing, I need some help from an accountant. So I think, Aaron, you made the point about, sustainability being a core competence of procurement people, and I certainly, wouldn't disagree with that. Procurement people need to have some knowledge and awareness, but I guess there's a point at which you say, okay, I know enough to know what I don't know, and to need to take advice. And maybe Duncan, if I can ask you for a view on that.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Yes, the as a procurement professional, it is always a challenge to know which bits do I need to be a specialist in and which bits do I need to know that I need to bring the specialist in. And you described some good ones there. You could broaden it out across all the competencies that a procurement person needs. I think one of the best ways I would describe competence, and some of the work that I've been doing off the back of the Grenfell disaster on competence in procurement, is actually the definition of competence is you need to also know what you're not competent in, and part of competence is being open about that and saying, I'm not an expert. I'll use Grenfell. I'm not an expert in fire safety, but I need to know that I've got someone around me who can actually properly advise me about fire safety when I'm actually buying the stuff I need to buy for a high-rise building. It's a classic example, I think, of recognising the gap in competence where it's there. That being said, I think as a procurement professional, you need to know the right questions to ask. And part of the challenge I think we've got is that sometimes people don't. They'll follow the process, they'll tick the boxes, they'll turn the handle, but they won't actually ask the questions around it about what else should we be doing here? What are the challenges? What are the risks? What are the opportunities? What is the focus that needs to be? So part of this skill set, I think, is having the breadth of knowledge, but also then knowing which questions to ask within your business or which questions to ask of your supplier base as to whether or not they are doing the right things. And that is a skill set. You've got to be, I think one of the phrases someone used recently was, you've got to be curious. You've got to have this sort of curiosity to understand and then say, okay, so if I now understand, then therefore what should I be doing about it, and what the drivers are that go forward. So I think there is a skill set. I think it is not necessarily just a skill set on sustainability. I think you need to know enough to then be able to go and ask the right questions and to drive things in the right way. And then, probably within your procurement team, you will have some experts who you can bring in to give you. I mean, you've got 3 or 4 on the call here, who've got that real passion and enthusiasm to give you that insight and the perspective around it. And I think that's an element of competence and focus and skills that are needed. I think that the other thing I was going to come back on, Sean, and I think it probably links to one of the other questions that I think Helen, you raised about risk and resilience. I actually think in procurement at the moment, there's a huge opportunity to link sustainability into these other focuses the business has got. Because if we are focusing on shorter supply chains, if we're focusing on visibility of your suppliers and knowing what's there, it's easier to link sustainability into that agenda, because everyone's really worried about everything that can go wrong. And I think, Aaron, you made the point, there's a fear factor there. There's a few things that really are fundamental that people don't want to be caught out by. Here's a great opportunity of linking that into that agenda on the risk map and starting to focus on the things that's there that people need to do. And I think there is a great opportunity to not only solve a problem, but also then move your business forward as well. But yeah, I think, you've made a plug a few times to go and do the e-learning on the ISO standard. To be honest, I haven't done it. And why haven't I done it?
Shame upon you.
Well, because I'm not an expert in sustainability. And I think that's a classic example of, do I really need to know it inside out, or do I need to know that there's a standard there, and do I need to know that someone in my organisation has gone through the standard and understands it and can advise me on the things that I need to be doing? For me, in a leadership role, that's my bit. But of course, the standard, I'm sure, is wonderful, Sean, and I will go and read it this weekend if there's no football on the telly.
Yeah, thanks, Duncan. No, you're absolutely right. It's that there is a question of who needs to know what, and you make a really good point about the soft skills. And really, the kind of issues of self-awareness and knowing the right questions to ask, and also how to ask the right questions. We've got both. We've got Natalie and then Aaron itching to add something to this discussion. Natalie.
Yeah, just a couple of points really. In terms of the questions, I think it's it's fundamental in terms of the right questions to ask within the procurement process. We have certain, I would say, sort of basic questions, mandatory questions that we've embedded into the process, and we use Achilles UVDB as some of our pre-qual. But when you're getting into the detailed questions in the RFP, sometimes I haven't got all the answers. I'm not an expert in the environmental agenda, for example. So we do bring experts in, but also we're trying to bring in the knowledge from the supply chain. So often the questions are so limited that the responses that, you know, we come back, we're probably missing innovation and ideas from the supply chain as well. So trying to leave it open in a way to get to the end result of what you want, but allow the supply chain to bring their knowledge into play as well, which is really tricky, because it's, you know, how do you balance it? But it's understanding how to position that. And then the other piece was around, you know, making use of business agendas. So supply chain mapping is a perfect case in point. I've been pushing for that since I joined National Grid, have better visibility of our supply chain. Suddenly, with the COVID situation, there's that reality. We need to know our supply chains better. And I'm literally just piggybacking then on that piece of work, because we're implementing a tool where we'll have better visibility. It's all structured around resilience and, you know, understanding our supply chains from a continuity perspective, but it's the same questions that we can be asking around the human rights and the sustainability agenda as well. So trying to not, as Duncan said, not duplicate work, try and make use of what's already happening in other areas. And I always positioned it as, you know, from a commercial perspective, you should know where your materials come from to be able to negotiate better. So trying to get it from that angle, not just from the human rights or sustainability angle, just to say that.
Okay, thanks, Natalie. Aaron, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I suppose it's partly an apology to Duncan, because I gave him a bit of a hard time last week around you know, my thoughts around having kind of a dedicated competency for sustainability, and, you know, having reflected on that and had a good look around the existing framework, I've kind of come full circle. I think there's still an argument potentially. You know, it is very definitely a technical competence, but I do like the way how they've integrated sustainability into the different elements of the procurement process and procurement competencies more broadly. How I think, to his point, that for me it's important that procurement people know how and they know when technically to consider sustainability in the procurement process. But I do think it's right to bring in the subject matter experts around particular areas. This whole issue of right question is really tricky, as Natalie said, because there's the relevance and proportionality piece. And what we've done is a huge piece of work kind of ahead of time using the heat map model to look at which are the areas and therefore what are the questions that are relevant for individual categories of supply. And so when you say I am buying bricks, it immediately kind of pulls through the questions for bricks. I am buying IT equipment, it immediately pulls through the relevant questions for them. And so it removes some of the burden from the procurement people to know what those right questions are, but it also removes some of the burden on the subject matter experts to get those basic questions right. Where it's a higher value, then yes, we'll consult and have those conversations, because again, to Natalie's point, that issue sometimes our requirements and our specifications can stifle innovation, because we're asking questions based on yesterday's practice, not on today's practice and the emerging new ways of working that are coming out through the supply chain. So there's a tension there as well. And just a final point on supply chain mapping, just from my perspective, just to kind of manage expectations on that. I'm not aware of a single organisation anywhere in the world who've successfully managed all of their supply chain through all the tiers of their supply chain. We once had a question from a customer, it wasn't National Grid, and they said, can you provide complete transparency of your entire supply chain through all the tiers right the way back to the point of raw material extraction? Answer, no. And so, you know, and anybody who said they could is a liar. I think there's one organisation who I became aware of who successfully managed to do that once. It took them 3 years to do it. And by the time they got to the end of the exercise, you can guess what happened. Their supply chain had changed and you have to start all over again. It's the fourth road bridge kind of scenario. And so I think there's definitely something about having greater visibility and greater transparency through the tiers. But I don't want to set any expectation in my business that I'm ever going to get to a point where I'll have full transparency through all the tiers right the way back to raw material extraction. So, and if anybody has successfully done that, everybody wants to hear from you, because we all need to learn from your model. So yeah, just a couple of points there.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. We have a little forest of hands up, but I'm very conscious that Yvonne McBride has had a question on the chat for quite some time. So we'll deal with that first, and then I'll go back to the hands. So Yvonne's question, how can I best support a social enterprise in Scotland to actively engage with construction and participate in the procurement process? Would anybody like to offer some advice there?
Yeah, Sean, can I just answer? Yeah, so in terms of Yvonne's question, I think in embedding sustainability and getting social enterprises or micro entities, family-run businesses on board, one of the things I did, Yvonne, was take a long, hard look at our procurement templates, our formats. Because if you send out an ITT document of 400 MB, for example, on a Crossrail or a high-speed 2, you immediately put off social enterprises, micro entities. They do not wish to bid. We are wasting their time and money. They hardly get further down the procurement process. We looked at what kind of dispensations we could offer them in terms of making that tender process shorter, making the ITT pack much smaller, and looking at things like, do we really need PI worth 10 million each and every occurrence? Is it feasible for that works package? What works packages we can offer to social enterprises or the local community? But one of the ways we engaged was, in a non-lockdown scenario, of course, was to run workshops in the boroughs affected by the project. So in Camden, in Houston, for example, with the help of Compete For, we ran workshops and we took them through the procurement process, what a tender looks like. We did a mock-up tender with them, helped them to fill out a bid in ITT pack and show them what good looks like, so that they could see if it was feasible for them to engage with us and actually win some work on the project. So workshops like those really helped us to get a diverse supply chain on board.
That's good advice. Thank you very much. We have a hand up from an audience member, so we'll go there first. Elizabeth.
Hi, thank you very much for all of the information so far. It's been a very interesting discussion. I'm one of the fabled QSers who, interestingly, has an interest in sustainability. I've been curious, can you actually foresee any sustainability targets of which procurement plays a part in achieving being established for the infrastructure industry? I find that there's so many targets and roadmaps out there for buildings through rebar challenges, but I think the only thing we have in the construction side, infrastructure based, is like we've got the MPA roadmap, we've got some social value and natural capital guidelines, but there's no clear targets of what are we all actually trying to achieve and by when.
Ooh, would any of our infrastructure colleagues like to pick that one up? Aaron, do you have a view on that?
To be honest, I'm not sure I understood the question, and it did break up a little bit for me. And so happy for somebody else to start, and I'll hopefully pick up the gist from their answer. I heard something about KPIs, but I didn't quite get the context. So I'll let Natalie go, and I'll follow.
I was going to say, I
Helen.
pick up a little bit. I think the reality is that all the targets that have been in place at the moment, particularly in infrastructure, are probably more leading edge than most of the construction sectors within those areas. But I still don't think people have got their head around whether there are specific targets for the supply chain yet. So I think if we think about my particular area of expertise in SP around modern slavery and human rights, there will be targets eventually in those areas because of the transparency requirements. As you get into scope 3, Natalie will be talking about what's happening in science-based targets. That has to come from the supply chain. I don't think it'll be industry-led, though. I think it'll be client-led. I think individual clients will drive those particular requirements as they get more intelligent around the fact that the impacts don't sit with the people they're contracting with, but the impacts actually sit with the supply chain. And unfortunately, I don't think our industry's yet quite cottoned onto that as effectively as it could do when we look at sector specific. We still look very project basis, or we still look very organisational basis. Whether that will change eventually, but I can't see it changing over the next sort of 12 to 18 months. I think that'll be a bit more longer term strategy.
We do have some initiatives in the supply chain school, though, and it's something that in the school we've tried to kind of move steadily from purely being a training and learning initiative through to, you know, we've now got over 110 partners in the school. So we're looking at how we can kind of use that leverage to effect change. So I'm very surprised, Helen, you didn't mention the People Matter Charter, because you do at every opportunity. But we are doing work in minimum standards, and Helen will talk about labour standards. But also we've been doing some work in plant, in looking at minimum standards for plant, and also our climate emergency group looking at how we can measure and drive carbon emissions down. So we're kind of doing our bit within the school, but I think you're right that there aren't kind of firm industry-wide targets. And I'll shut up and let Helen talk about People Matter, and then we're getting quite close to the end and might need to close in a minute.
I actually wasn't going to mention People Matter Charter, but thank you for the link in, Sean.
You always mention People Matter Charter.
I know, I wasn't actually going to. So for everybody who's on this call, if you don't know, do go onto the Supply Chain website, Supply Chain School website, and have a look at the People Matter Charter. It's been a great success. We were targeted to try and get 100 signatories by the end of this financial year. Then this really inconvenient thing called COVID came in, so I was a little worried about how the hell we were going to do that, all being at home. We had our 80th signatory yesterday, so you know, we probably might not hit full target, but we're going to get close. And the beauty of this strategy is about embedding the same sorts of requirements as we get further down the supply chain. So trying to drive transparency around all people issues, whether it's EDI, whether it's skills, whether it's living wage, whether it's modern slavery, whether it is transparent material, human rights, supply chains. So that's my sort of quick shout out. Go and have a look. Anybody who's interested in it, drop me an email. I'm always happy to talk for hours, but I won't because we've only got 3 minutes. I have two things though that I'm going to just quickly talk about. One of them is supply chain engagement, supply chain management, supply chain development. We've talked very much about holistically procurement, but actually a lot of what sustainability is about developing your supply chain, and actually a thing that we're not very good at doing in construction is managing our supply chain effectively and developing it over time. So don't underestimate the power of needing to then go out to the wider supply chain and think, I've got a gap, how do I fill it? And sustainability is usually one of those mechanisms that allows you to do that. My final one, which is a bit of a loaded question, is if we don't think, or a loaded statement, if we don't think that procurement necessarily needs to have sustainability in there, and we've got sustainability professionals who don't necessarily understand procurement, have we now therefore created a new role, which is a sustainable procurement professional? Because actually it's a lot, yeah, I know, Aaron, there's not very many of us. There's a lot of sustainability people who don't understand procurement, but need to get into procurement. And procurement people understand procurement, but need to necessarily understand how sustainability works. So if it can't sit in one part and can't sit in the other, here's a loaded question. Should we be creating a new role in procurement called Sustainable Procurement Champions and roles? And I can see 4 of us on the call, 5 of us on the call, but I don't think there's many out there. So I'll leave that one with you, Sean.
Right, thanks, Helen. And I'm going to attempt to summarise and close in a minute, but Aaron's got a hand up, so I have the penultimate word for Aaron, and then I really am going to have to close things down. Aaron.
No, definitely to vigorously agree with Helen. I think certainly the higher paid and better rewarded, the better, I think. Just a point around supply chain development, because there's this other issue around market engagement as well, because there's a danger if you only work with the suppliers that you're currently working with, you create this kind of Premier League type situation, and actually that undermines competitiveness. What we need to do is kind of rise the tide, generally speaking, and that's ensuring that companies outside of your existing supply chain are aware of what your requirements are, and you support them through things like the Supply Chain Sustainability School to develop capability such that the next time you tender, you've got more companies who can meet your requirements, and which then drives competition and prices down. So yeah, that was my point. I may have had another, but I forget what it was now. So yeah, just the link to market engagement beyond supply chain development.
Okay, thanks very much. I really am going to have to wrap and try and summarise now. A final point. We in the Supply Chain School have been working for the last 12 months on something we call performance through procurement, where we've been working with CIPS and many of the people on the call. We are going to be launching in April 8 new e-learning modules and a self-assessment on procurement skills. So please do watch out for that, those procurement people on the call. I'm not even going to attempt to summarise the debate because it's been absolutely fascinating and we've ranged around all sorts of things. Firstly, thanks to Helen, whose idea this was to have this discussion. I've really enjoyed it. I think it's been absolutely brilliant. I could have kept it going all day, but unfortunately we can't. Thanks very much to our speakers for giving us such fascinating perspectives on some of the issues that we've unearthed. And I guess, you know, that there's maybe some themes that we can pick up on that have come out of this, where we can maybe do more of these types of sessions. It's the first time, I think, in the supply chain school that we've run a debate. So be very interested in getting your feedback, audience, please, on what you think of that. Is this the right sort of format to go forward? Because obviously we can run these on a number of subjects if you find it of interest. So we're absolutely out of time. We've overrun by 1 minute. Apologies for that, everybody. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.